So Dennis and Mark, thank you both for joining me.
Pleasure.
Now we're in part 2. We're continuing the discussion for a little while longer. Why is Q in intensive care? Yeah.
Well, it's in intensive care for 2 reasons, and one of the reasons is a place where I strongly agree with Mark. Namely, Luke surely knows Matthew. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't know Q, but it does mean that he knows Matthew, and you simply cannot, in a knee-jerk way, compare Luke and Matthew without assessing the possibility that Luke is not only redacting Matthew, but is creatively changing it. So I think that's a real advantage of what you've accomplished, and I'm sincere about that. And that's one reason I think that Q is in intensive care. I'm trying to prevent it from going to hospice. Okay, so that's the first piece. The second is that once one establishes, according to the 2-document hypothesis, the existence of Q, there are still many overlaps with Mark. So there's a alternative to the 2-document hypothesis, which is advocated by Harry Flaterman and others, namely that Mark knows Q as well. The problem with that is the people that hold to that hypothesis never consider Mark in a reconstruction of Q. So that, I think, is a huge shortcoming. I am convinced that Mark knows Q, and in fact is one of the most important witnesses to it. Now, informing that is something that Mark has not talked about, if I can call you Mark. You can call me Dennis. Okay. And you have in the past, by the way. I think we need more. The image that I'm going to give you is that the synoptic problem is very much like a huge and complex jigsaw puzzle. And we have a flat table with only half of the pieces, in my view. And so we're reassembling this without a pattern from the box or the map of the jigsaw puzzle. And I think we need more pieces to the puzzle. Now, one possible piece would be the Q document. And I think Jacob's question to you about the many sources that Luke is using is an indication that there are more pieces that are missing. And as you know, I'm a huge advocate of Homeric imitation, especially in Mark and in Luke. Now, we can debate that, and I don't want to right now. It's just that if that is true, we have a lot more pieces on the table than we've had before. And it allows for a recognition of the patterns in a different way. And so I would say that that's where the problem is. You have 2 natal difficulties in the 2-document hypothesis. And I'm just summarizing now.
But I suppose
Luke surely knows Matthew, and Mark may know Q if it exists.
So okay, if I make a
please, of course.
So that's great, and it's really lovely here. I know you know that. I know you say this, but it's lovely hearing you say that you think that Luke knew Matthew. That's great. And I suppose one of the things I just have to say this is one of these things where it's like, help me in my unbelief, because I really want there to be more jigsaw pieces of the puzzle. I mean, every time there's a new manuscript discovered, or a new, like there was this little fragment P Oxy 5575, and it's tiny, and there's just a few lines, and it's got some parallels with Matthew and Luke and Thomas, and people go, oh my goodness, is this Q and so. I mean, I wasn't worried about it. I was excited, like, because basically that's another new jigsaw piece. The problem is, I think that we've got many fewer pieces than like half the puzzle, and so it is difficult. And I desperately wish that we had more, but of the pieces that we do have, I suppose I'm a minimal sources person. not because I think other sources didn't exist, but I'm not convinced that anyone's been able to, with all due respect, and I love your work, I'm not convinced that Luke has any more than Matthew and Mark and other stuff that we don't have, if that makes sense, Old Testament and one or two other things. So that's the thing, is I'm a help me in my unbelief kind of on this.
Well, I would, here's one of the things I very much appreciate about you, Mark, is that you acknowledge that there may be lost sources. Mm-hmm. The problem is in reconstructing them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then taking that as hermeneutically muscled into the discussion.
Yeah.
And so you are, I would say, Q-averse light, where there are other people that are Q-averse heavy.
Yeah.
And I would love to help your disbelief. And so I'm right. Yeah. Actually, I wrote a book you probably haven't seen, Must the Synoptics Remain a Problem?
Oh, no, I haven't seen that yet.
And unfortunately, I brought a copy with me and gave it away.
Oh,
but it's an attempt to deal with Q-skepticism. And you are mentioned in the book, and not negatively, but just as an alternative. And it argues that there are two keys to unlocking the synoptic problem. One of which is Mark's use of Homer. Mm-hmm. Another is Mark's use of Q. And I give 34 examples of places where, when Mark is imitating Homer, he inserts Q sayings. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you just one example that you would agree with. All reconstructions of Q take seriously the doublets in Matthew and Luke about blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Mm-hmm. Two of them occur in passages where all Q advocates say, yes, it must have appeared there in the woes to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
It also appears in the triumphal entry story, word for word. So you have doublets in both cases. The story of Jesus going into the so-called triumphal entry, which is really an untriumphal entry, of course, has a wonderful Homeric parallel. And so Mark is interested in generating narrative from Homer, but inserting Jesus' sayings into a narrative context. So that's, you'd have to look at the book. This is not the time to...
Sure, no, it's dead interesting. I mean, I love that parallel, that the blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. I mean, I suppose I've tended to see the flow of traffic as being... begins in Mark, then in Matthew 23. Matthew's already narrated that story by that point. Actually, has he? Yes, he has. We're already in Jerusalem, aren't we? Then we get in 23, Jerusalem, and you will not see me again until, and he's presumably talking about the second coming there. And then Luke pulls it right forward into chapter 13, where it's kind of weird because he says Jerusalem, and he's not there yet.
That is how you would take it. Now, here's another place where in my listening to you, I'd love to have a longer conversation. I think Luke knows Matthew, okay? We agree on that. I also think he often likes to ignore Matthew.
Yeah.
And he's not particularly fond of Matthew. And Matthew's commitments to Israel and to Judaism and to Torah observance is not a big deal for Luke. And so I think we can... So I would scrub a lot of Matthew out of Luke where you valorize it.
I think I agree with that largely. I mean, one of my teachers, Eric Franklin, wrote a book called Luke, Interpreter of Paul, Critic of Matthew.
There you go.
And it's worth remembering that if Luke knows Matthew, he's left more of the new stuff behind than he's taken over. In other words, special Matthew as a group of material, not I don't believe in that as a source, but as a group of material, stuff unique to Matthew, is a bigger data set than the double tradition, which is only about 200 verses. So Luke must have thought that a lot of Matthew is dispensable.
I agree.
In a way that he doesn't really think with Mark. With Mark, you've got the Great Omission, where, like, from the end of Mark 6 to the middle of Mark 8, that's gone. Otherwise, it's pretty much all there.
That's right. I know. I agree
Luke
with you.
likes
Yeah,
Mark in a
no,
way.
I
think you're right. I think Luke must have thought that he was going to take over the best of Matthew. So I think he liked some of the poetry, and I think he likes one or two of the parables, but he's not. I mean, it's fascinating, but he doesn't take over some of the more, what I think of as like the bizarre Matthean stories, like the coin in the fish's mouth in Matthew 17, or the zombie pericope.
No, I agree with all that.
I mean, like, Lisa, what's going on here? We don't, we're not having this. You
Okay,
know?
here's another piece where I think we're on the same wavelength, and are different from so many of our colleagues who deal with the synoptic problem. That is, we understand that the philology of the synoptic problem requires sensitivity to literary cretivity, as opposed to a rigid philological, almost anal way of understanding how language works, how texts work. And you're really quite brilliant about that. I would like to think that I can be too.
Absolutely.
But I think so much of synoptic problem work has boiled down to a narrow sense of what philology is, instead of literary creativity.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. We also used to call it cut and paste, like the idea that they're kind of... People don't say cut and paste as much now because... because we do all the things on, very, very fancy word processing,
One other thing I want to mention, if I might, I'm doing a book called Feuding Gospel Authors, Why Authors Differ from Each Other, and they often do so quite dramatically. So my characters are different from yours. But the other thing that I'm doing is I'm replacing modern biblical scholarship words with words that are used in ancient rhetoric for describing conflation and substitution and rearrangement, because we do know that rhetoricians taught people how to use their prototypi, their antecedents. And so I use that vocabulary for the authors talking to each other. And I'm surprised how fruitful that is, actually.
Cool.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.